Welcome to Windows Presentation Foundation using templates to customize WPF controls. In this screencast, I'll do a brief demonstration of how to build a control template. First, a quick intro. Control templates are a very powerful feature of WPF. They allow you to easily change the look and feel of existing controls without having to redesign the controls from scratch. They are probably the best way to make an application that is unique and interesting looking and yet still present a consistent appearance. Both styles and templates can be used to modify the appearance of controls in WPF. Styles, which were covered in a separate video, allow you to modify minor characteristics, whereas templates let you make wholesale changes to a control. The thing that makes it work is the control template that's associated with the control. This is what defines the visual structure of a control and makes it possible to improve reusability. A control author can define a default or out-of-the-box appearance. And then an application author can use the control, and if she wants, she can override the template to modify the control's visual appearance. Although this screencast focuses on building a control template for an existing control, you should also know that if you create your own custom control, you should design it with this framework in mind so that your controls are more reusable. Let's take a look at how to build a control template for a button. We'll start with a new WPF application. I've made only minor changes. I've changed the default grid layout to a stack panel and made the orientation horizontal. Other than that, this is strictly coming from File New. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a simple button. We'll make the width equal to 100 and we'll make the height equal to 100 as well, and we'll add some content in there simply saying click. So this is a default button. It's the default look and feel that you would expect from WPF. Now we know that we can edit style properties such as font, width, height, and background. So for instance, I could go in here and change the background property to be equal to dark red, and immediately I can see the results of that modification. We could also take that and make a style out of it so that the style is reusable. But with styles, we can't alter the basic composition of the button. It's always going to be rectangular with a fairly straightforward look and feel. Now that's where control templates come in. A control template can be defined in a number of places, but the two most common are the app.xaml resource dictionary or in local resources. We'll do it right here, locally, in window1.xaml, so that we don't have to switch back and forth between the XAML files. I'll simply add resources, and then I'll define a control template, and anything in resources needs to have a key, so we'll give it a key of my button. Now we have an empty control template. If I bind the button to this control template, I can do that simply by specifying a value for the template property to point to static resource my button. And you'll notice that what happens is the button disappears. Now actually the button still exists on the page, but there's no UI visible because we're overriding the visual content of the button with the control template, and the control template is empty. Let's add some content. The first thing I should point out is that the control template takes only one child, so you'll usually want to use some sort of container. That is, something that can house multiple controls. In this case, I'll use a grid. Now let's add an ellipse to the grid. Let's make it green. Now already we see a problem. The button obviously wants to be dark red, and yet the control template is simply ignoring that and instead forcing the button to be green. And that's sort of bad form. So what I'll do instead of selecting a pre-chosen color, I'll simply use template binding to bind this property to whatever the user supplies as background. So you can see that now the fill of the ellipse is going to be taken from the background color, and if we change the background color, for instance we change this from dark red to blue, you'll see that the ellipse color changes as well. Template binding is really useful. because it allows us to create templates whose styles can be modified just as the built-in controls are modified. Next, let's address content. Now, back when we first created the button, before we bound it to our template, we might have noticed that it had the word click. But that word has disappeared. The text is gone. Now, it stands to reason that we'd want the text in our button to be configurable. So we'll take care of that with something called a content presenter. I'm going to place the content presenter immediately below the ellipse, and based on the fact that it comes after the ellipse, this means that it's going to exist on top of it. So the text should appear above the ellipse. We'll set the horizontal alignment property to center. We'll set the vertical alignment property equal to center. And then finally, and here's the important part, we'll set the content to be equal to another template binding. This time we'll specify the property is equal to content control dot content. And notice that now whatever content we have defined in the button here will appear inside of our new control template. Now let's make it a little fancier just by adding some additional XAML. Now I'm going to paste in some XAML here because what I'm pasting in isn't really anything that is template specific. It's just XAML designed to make a more attractive button. And making an attractive UI is, after all, the point of being able to use styles and templates in the first place. Now you can see that we have a nice border with a gradient fade, another silver border around, so we're starting to see the beginnings of a slightly more interesting looking button. Now, in between the ellipse that we defined in the very beginning and the content control, let's add a little highlight just to make the button look that much more attractive. Now, we have a button that has a fairly complete appearance, at least at first glance. Let's go ahead and see if this works in an application. If we run our app, we should see our button, and the button appears to look like we would expect it to. The problem with the button now is that it's not going to have the complete behavior of a button. We're used to buttons that have mouse over effects, and this one doesn't. We're used to buttons that when you click them, their appearance changes, and this one doesn't. So we're not going to fully implement it, just in the interest of time, but we are going to make a few changes, and the ways that we can provide feedback and make the button change its appearance based on things that are happening to it is through triggers. So down below the visual element that's in my content control, I'm going to add a definition for control template dot triggers. And in the control template dot triggers, I'm going to define a single trigger that is associated with the property of button dot is pressed. Now, when the value of is pressed is equal to true, then I want to set some properties. So to do that, I use a setter. The property that I want to set is going to be the button.render transform property, and the target is called button center. And since that comes from the XAML that I pasted in, let's go ahead and take a look at what that's all about. So again, I'm changing the value of button.render transform from some target called button center. Let's go find it. What I've done is I've defined a grid that is a child of the outside grid. So we can nest layout panels and containers and so forth in each other. And so in this case, we have a button center grid, and that's the target. and I've got several ellipses and the content control inside. And what this allows me to do is, by using button center, I can treat the entire collection of elements, 2 ellipses plus the text or the content control. I can treat it all as one, and I can scale it all as one. In fact, if you remember, the trigger that I'm going to, or the property that I'm going to modify, is render transform. And if we look for render transform, you'll notice that render transform is actually defined here in the XAML, and we specify a scale value of 0.98 and 0.98. We can change that, and this really should be grid.renderTransform. And we're changing it by specifying a new value, and that new value is going to be a new scale transform. This time, instead of 0.98, it'll be just slightly smaller, 0.95 in both directions. So again, I could continue to do that for other types of triggers so that it's a more complete implementation. But let's see what we've done. We've made it so that when we click the button, the ellipse, the dark red ellipse, the highlight ellipse, as well as the text, all of that will contract a little bit thanks to its scale being dialed down just a bit. So it gives us the appearance of the button being pressed in. So my button is now done, and this should give you a pretty good idea of what authoring control templates looks like. But one more thing, and that is, the benefits of this is that now we can reuse this control, and a control template that's designed well will be reusable, and it will react kindly when you do things like making changes to height and width, etc. So for instance, I can go down here, make a copy of this button, and since we're in a stack panel, all I have to do is paste it in the right location a couple more times, and now I have 3 of them. And if I want to change the background, for instance, I can simply modify that value. And because I'm template binding, my button will then take on the new appearance. All right. I can also make other changes that you would expect. So for instance, this first one, I can change the font family to be equal to something else. Maybe I can change here in the second one the font size to be equal to maybe something a little larger. And I can even change the width and height of the entire control. Let's make it 140 by 140. And now, because of the way that the control was designed, the button responds nicely. And we should be able to run this now and have 3 buttons that are all working and usable as normal WPF buttons. Thanks very much for your time, and I hope you learned something today about control templates. Thank you.